Hello, my name's Joey, and today I'll be showing you a tutorial on how to change scenes additively, or transitionally. Now, what that means basically is transitive scene loading versus just the normal way of scene loading is kind of like the difference between Ori and the Blind Forest and like a normal like Kirby game or something like that. Where in a Kirby game, or like maybe some Castlevania games, I guess, when a player moves all the way to the right of a screen, to the point where the camera stops following them and they walk through a hole in the wall, it immediately fades to black and then pops in with the next level. And while there's not really anything wrong with that, in certain games where you don't want to pull the character away or make them feel like, oh, this is a game and they have to load the next thing or whatever, or like you don't want there to be such a clear cut, like a game like Ori and the Blind Forest, you can do something called additive scene loading, where it keeps, for a small portion of time, it keeps both scenes loaded long enough to where the player doesn't even realize that there was a loading screen because they were still playing through it. Or like it didn't take time to stop everything to load the next screen. So essentially, it would look something like this. I mean, the camera would be following the player normally, but it would look something like this, where one scene is loaded, represented by the yellow platform, and then the player, after they hit a certain point, it loads the next scene, while keeping the last one still loaded. And then after they get to a point where they can't see the first scene anymore, it unloads it. So for this tutorial, I won't be focusing on things like, camera movement or a character control or anything like that. That's just something you would have to do yourself. That's not really the point of this tutorial. The one thing you would need, though, is a player with a box collider is the most important part. Is that they have something that the player senses or detects collision. That's the most important part, and the only thing you really need for this in your player controller. And obviously the ability to move. But basically, what you're going to need is two levels, basically. Scenes. You'll need one level that you start in, another level that gets loaded up, and the third scene you need is what's called the base scene, or in this case I have it called tutorial, but you are going to want your camera, your player, and any potential HUD items like your health or your mini-map all to be in the base scene, because those are things that need to not be unloaded when you leave a scene. The things that can be unloaded when you leave a scene are all the things that are specific to that scene, like platforms, enemies, and these door points, which are what we're going to be focusing on for this tutorial. So, you need to start by having only one scene loaded. We're going to start with level 1, as I've titled it. You're going to want to create two. They have to start off as empty objects, and then what I'm calling them door points. You add two empty objects, and then add box colliders to them. Box collider 2D, which you can add by doing the add component thing down here. Make them both triggers, or check the is trigger checkbox over here. You place the load, I'm calling this one load level 2 because it's being used to load level 2, and this one that's being used to unload level 2. Now what this means, and this is what the finished product will be, but what this means is when the player is in level 1, they pass this object right here, or this one, and it loads the next scene. And if they touch this object, it unloads that last scene. Now you need to make sure that the unload object is to the left of the load object if the scene you're loading is to the right. This means that if the player decides not to actually, if they go just here and then decide to go back to level 1 without actually exploring the loaded level 2, you can unload that level and not have it loaded while you're not even using it. So what you are going to add to each of these empty objects or with the box collider on them, they're each going to have their own script. For the load level object, you're going to make a script that I'm calling loader. Now in loader, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to have a public string that I'm calling next scene name and a public static boolean or bool that I'm just calling something like load with 3 A's because load is used in a lot of things in Unity and it can just get confusing having 8 billion different variables all by the name of load. So I have that. Then you're going to create a method, a private void on trigger enter 2D with a collider 2D parameter and call it collision or call. That's just the general, preset thing in Unity or in the C#. Then you make an if statement. You have all of this on there. If in parentheses collision.gameObject.name equals in parentheses player or whatever you're calling the character that you're controlling, whatever that object's called, which should be player. That's what it's checking for first. Basically, if the object that this script is attached to collides with the player. The second thing it's checking for is if the next scene is not loaded. So you do parenthesis or exclamation point scene manager dot get scene by name parentheses next scene name, the string you have here, dot is loaded. And the parentheses is basically saying to make sure it's not loaded. That's what it's checking for. Then within that if statement, you do another if statement that's checking if this load is true or not. If it is true, it immediately makes it false and then exits out of this this method entirely. If this load is already false, it skips this little tidbit of code and gets to this main part, which is scene manager dot load scene parentheses next scene name comma load scene mode dot additive. What this basically means is that it's loading the next scene without unloading the previous scene. So there will be a period of time where they're both loaded, and it sets load to true. Within this method this script and the other script we make, you want to go up and add this to it, unityengine.scene management. This is very important because it's the whole basis of what we're working on, of switching between scenes. It needs this to be able to use a lot of these, the dot load scene and the scene manager stuff in general. So you go back to your load object, you attach the loader script to it, and under this parameter right here, the next scene name, you type in whatever the second scene is called, which in my case is level 2. And then that's good to go. The second object, the unload level object I have right here to the left of the load level one, this also has the box collider with the trigger. But in this one, you're going to create a script called unloader. For this, you do something kind of similar and opposite, where you do public string last scene name, is what I'm calling it. You make another private void on trigger enter 2D with the collider 2D collision, and you basically copy and paste the if statement from before, but the only thing you need to change is this exclamation point in front of the scene manager, because instead of checking the collision with the player and checking that the scene isn't loaded, now you're going to be checking if the if it collides with the player and the scene is loaded. You also have to change this to be whatever this string is when you if you do copy and paste it. But you do that collision.gameObject.name equals player and scene manager.getSceneByName parentheses last scene name dot is loaded. Within the if statement, you're going to put this here, the scene manager dot unload scene async parentheses last scene name. And this also has the Unity engine dot scene management thing up here, the using. So back in the tutorial, you attach that unloader script to that object, and in the last scene name, you put level 2. So then once everything's attached to those correctly, it loads that scene, and it unloads the scene when it interacts with each of those objects appropriately. So that's half of it. But you also need the same thing for level 2. So in level 2, you're going to create those 2 more door points, but you're going to call them load level 1 and unload level 1. And make sure the load level 1 is to the left of unload level 1, because the level 1 is, as a whole, is to the left of level 2. So this will do the same thing once finished, where it, loads level 1 when you pass through the loader box and unloads when you pass through that one. You're going to attach the loader script to level 1, and under next scene name, put level 1. And for the unload level 1, you're going to attach the unloader script and put under last scene name level 1. These also both have to be triggers. And also, in general, whenever you're working with this, make sure that there's no way when the player walks through here that they could somehow avoid running into these triggers. Because if they do, then they would essentially walk left into a bottomless void, and there'd be no scene there for them to load. A good way to do this would be to just add a little ceiling right there, like a tunnel, to prevent them from, skipping it entirely, or just make stretch the box collider up really high and make sure there's no way the player could possibly just avoid it. So now you have all that, but there's one more thing you got to make sure of. You got to go into your build settings and make sure all 3 of these scenes are added to the build setting, and you need to make sure they're in order. So level 1 has to be before level 2, because when it switches back and forth, it needs to be able to, it needs to recognize that this scene comes before this one when it loads a previous scene. And also, whenever you're testing out your level, like in the editor, 1, always make sure the space scene is loaded, because that has to have the player in it. And make sure you're unloading, moving your player around to wherever, and unloading the scenes you're not using, so that it doesn't mess with what's loaded and what's not loaded. So if you're testing something out in level 1, you want to only have level 1 loaded, and if you want to go over and without exiting out of it, go test something out in level 2, you can do that, and it won't have multiple, instances of the same level loaded by having, if you start it with them both loaded. And that's basically everything. This can be a very useful way to create a less stark transition in a game where you just want the player to be able to flow through it without having a kind of a video gamey reminder of like fading out and fading into a new area. It can help add a sense of flow. So thanks for watching.